Hello everyone and welcome to the Human Edge in Conversation Expert Series. I am Dr. Khosi, Jiyane, clinical psychologist, master trainer and leadership development coach. In conversation with me today is Anja van Beek. Welcome, Anja.
Good morning, Khosi. I'm so excited, looking forward to our conversation.
Same here. So with the 8th of March being International Women's Day, we thought it would be a good place for us to perhaps look into the space of all things women, and particularly looking at women in the corporate space, looking at how the landscape has been changing over the years, what some of the challenges are as we sit here today in 2024, the few myths that may be there as well, and to share a few tips with our audience today.
Yeah, and Khosi, it's such an important topic. I think, as you said, looking at some of the challenges, I think that's such a good place to start.
Yeah.
Because if we look at the landscape and the business landscape over the last 5 years, it has dramatically changed.
Yeah.
And I think all of us can relate with a world where everything is just going faster and faster.
Right.
Increased complexity and uncertainty.
Yes.
And I think that's why let's have a look at some of the trends that we see.
Right. And I guess it is about how do we juggle that complexity, what seems many a times to be competing priorities. And perhaps a good place before we even look at challenges would be, from your point of view, I mean, you've had quite a lengthy relationship with the Human Edge that goes back to your time in the corporate space. Perhaps let's check in on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I have not calculated exactly, but I think it's about 17 years ago that I had the privilege of partnering with the Human Edge for the first time, and in the capacity of being a client. So the challenge we faced at that point in time was breaking down the silos in our organization, and that's where we partnered with them on a journey of let's see what needs to change in the culture, and how can we identify some vital behaviors in order to create a culture that's more inclusive. Yeah, and of course, interesting enough, from a personal perspective, that was also the time where I was a single mum, juggling the balls of a demanding job. I was so proud to be the human resources director at the point in time, but with 2 young kids. And how do I navigate that transition of me? So, and then about 8 years ago, I started my own coaching and consulting business, and I said, please, can I be one of the facilitators? And that's why I'm so passionate facilitating the workshops, simply because I know the power of the skills that we teach.
Yeah, and it's always a privilege for me to share space with you over the years. So I really look forward to us really, unpacking some of these dynamics that we're going to look at today. So perhaps a starting point could be looking at what are the leading trends, or what are the common trends in the workspace as we sit here today.
Yeah, so there's many trends that I can mention, but I think the top few that I would like to start with is, first of all, the whole hybrid versus remote working reality.
Right.
Now that we post-pandemic, people starting to get back to the office, I think that whole scenario of how do you navigate is so important. Secondly, there's a big trend in the increased focus on employee wellness.
Okay.
And just having a look at how does leaders focus on creating an environment where there's a space to talk about wellness, and what does it mean in the business landscape.
Right.
Thirdly, of course, the important one is all about employee engagement. And actually, I want to transition rather to employee experience.
Right.
Because it's more than just only engagement. It's how do you experience the whole work cycle as part of the team. So I think let's start with those. There's a few more things, like I think an important one would be the evolution of leadership, and just looking at the reality. We spoke about complexity, we spoke about fast changing environment, and what what is required, what is that difference,
right,
how we need to show up as leaders. And then I think lastly, it's all about that inclusive workspace.
Yeah.
If we talk diversity, inclusion,
right,
that sense of belonging is just so critical.
Yeah, yeah. I would imagine also, I mean, we can't really talk about the world of work or the workspace without talking about the impact of technology.
Yeah.
AI is increasingly, encroaching into the space, and it is about how do we understand that relationship between human beings and AI and what it means for the future of work.
Khosi, that's such an important point, because whenever I think of technology, we need to look at it from two lenses. First of all, for leaders to understand when they introduce technology into the workspace, let's say it's a new CRM system or it's a new accounting software or whatever, performance management system.
Right.
They need to understand what the team members will experience, that transition through change.
Yes.
And understanding the impact on change, because otherwise they might just see, my team is resisting, or they're not as excited as I am.
Yeah.
And secondly, from the other lens, is to look at it from how can we really use technology and the data in order to support the strategy. What are we doing with those data? I have a lovely example that I would love to share.
Yeah.
This was, last year I met a lady called Melisha, who's the Group HR People and Culture at EOH.
Right.
And listen to what they've done. The HR team, there was a video that they watched, and looking at the video, they realized, but there's different perspectives looking at the same video within the team. And then they created a virtual reality series where people look at a video, it's interaction between different people.
Yeah.
And then as part of the virtual reality, you can choose, I now want to take on the lens of a colored woman or a white male. And depending on that lens, you actually experience in their feet or in their shoes how the situation pan out. Imagine you can use technology for that.
Geez, I could not have imagined that those things are possible already. I mean, we are certainly headed for interesting times, and very often people feel threatened by technology, but what I'm hearing you say is, how do we leverage technology in order to enhance human capability and human experience in the corporate space?
Absolutely.
So if we start where you started in terms of remote and hybrid working arrangements, what are the trends? What seems to be happening? And I know that, as you started by saying that COVID, the pandemic, very much punctuated that space. So where are we finding ourselves kind of 3 years to the day, 3-4 years to the day?
Yeah, the trend that I'm seeing, Khosi, is that most of the companies that I work with is looking at a hybrid solution.
Right.
So some of the organizations have said people need to be back at the office full time.
Yeah.
And that was not necessarily very well received because people were so used to the luxury of being at home and having a little bit more flexibility. And
it's interesting. There's a term that I saw recently. They talk about, there's been issues around absenteeism and presenteeism, which I kind of are familiar with. But what has emerged as a consequence of this dynamic around hybridity and remote work is resenteeism, which is what you're talking about. People resenting to be dragged out of their comfort of working from home back into the office. So that's still very much a place that you're saying is still, the ground is still shifting. People are still finding themselves there.
Absolutely. And really having the courage to have the conversation with the employees in terms of what does the future look like. So if we think there's benefits, because if we say yes to being back at the office, what do we say no for, and vice versa? And really having the courage to have those conversations, because I don't think it's only the leadership that needs to sit in the office and say, okay, this is why we want people. Let's have a look and understand from the employee's perspective why they prefer the hybrid option.
Which then, for me, links to the second point that you made, which was about employee wellness and well-being. Because what you're saying is that the way that people are now looking at that relationship between work, the worker, and the workplace is changing as well, and that it's not just a dictated relationship, but one that where the conversations are ongoing and need to continue to happen to fine-tune that balance between, of course, delivering performance and delivering on results, but also taking into account the well-being of employees. It's not an easy juggle, I imagine.
No, it's not an easy juggle, Khosi, and I think what is so important to remember there is wellness or employee well-being was a topic that was not really relevant.
Yes.
I mean, you did not really spoke about
it was
the
not at the
well-being.
center.
No, it was not at the center.
Yeah.
And now shifting towards that, and some amazing examples that I can use is one organization that I know, they have a program that's called Dream of the Doers.
Dream of the Doers.
Yeah,
wow. Okay.
And with that program, what they actually do is at the beginning of each year, allow each and every employee the opportunity to set personal goals. Yeah, and then they actually get an internal coach to support them to achieve that. So that's their way of looking at the well-being of their employees. And I mean, the personal goal can be anything from I want to finish, or I want to achieve a driver's license, or I want to study something, or I want to swim, learn to swim, or play the piano, or whatever. It's really up to the employee to choose what they want to develop from a personal space.
That's really interesting, because what it also means for me is that that relationship is being recalibrated, in that it's not just looking at a person as an instrument to the results that the organization wants to drive, but it's about taking really a very much more invested relationship in the overall well-being of an employee. I mean, if you're citing things like getting a driver's license, wanting to learn the piano, and even the organization going beyond just knowing what your dreams are, but in facilitating you know, working towards achieving those goals, I imagine that would have a spin-off in terms of who you become as an employee and your contribution, and importantly also the relationship that you have with the organization. So you also touched earlier on about employee engagement and employee experience. It sounds to me like that's at the heart of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, what's at the heart of the employee experience is really to be clear about what I call the invisible leader. Right. And that's the purpose of the organization. And do you communicate, or do you have conversations around that? Yeah. But just the last thing on the employee well-being, there's another organization that really invests time, and their program focus on supporting the individual to design or get clarity on their purpose in life. Sure. And I think how powerful is that when you sit with a team where you know, this is my individual purpose, now I understand the purpose of the organization, and how do we marry that? Because I think, especially for the younger generation, it's so important for them to understand what's that link between my contribution and the overall strategy of the organization.
And I think the organizational mindset shift that is taking place is going to be an important consideration, because what we're seeing in the younger generation is not that they're not just looking for a job as such. You know, it is important. They're saying all these things matter. And it's going to become any organization's competitive advantage, the extent to which they are sensitized and very much attuned and accommodating of those aspirations. And it also means that you get a better fit between what the employee aspires to, what their dreams, what their goals are, and the direction of the organization. You don't have that, you know, a grudge of people, you know, being squeezed into a circle. And we're moving more towards deliberate and conscious efforts to align those things, rather than if we achieve them, it's by luck rather than by concerted effort.
Yeah. So, Khosi, I love the word intentional. And another example that I want to use when we think of employee experience is how intentional are you to make an impact from day one that the employee apply at your organization, through to the onboarding, through to the first performance management conversation, etc. But I mean, just think of the younger ones. I mean, on their phones the whole time, every day. What does your recruitment look like? Are you making use of technology? Is it automated, or is it still old school? Because that's where you talk about alignment and goals, and they're big organizations that seems to be moving forward, future fit. So it's small things like that that we need to take into account when you think of the employee experience.
All right. So what I find interesting in what you're saying is that if we look at the history of when technology, started encroaching on the world of work, and specifically cell phones, it was keep those things out of, there was a clear attempt to separate work from technology, but you're saying there's a realization that the cell phone's not going anywhere. And how do we then perhaps integrate it and bring it into the space so that it works with what the person and the organization are trying to achieve?
And I think, Khosi, that's an important point too. When you think of employee experience, it's all about co-creating with a team. And I think that's, again, such a beautiful example or beautiful word to use when you look at the employee experience is let me listen to what you want. Because it's not the same. It's not a one size fits all. I mean, when you think of the employee experience, it might be totally different for someone in a development team versus someone that's client facing. And really to say, looking at the different groups in the organization, how do I co-create an employee experience that's
an atmosphere that's conducive. And I mean, if we think about the younger generation that's increasingly entering the workspace, they were born with technology. This is like their second parent, as it were. Many of them as babies have been with technology. So to ask of them to separate from that creates a lot of separation anxiety. And we're saying, rather than separate, let's be intentional about integrating that, which for me also links to the last point that you made earlier on around the technology as such, and specifically AI and the human factor, how we bring that together, again, for the better, outcome of the organization and employees as well.
And Khosi, whenever I think of technology and AI, for me it's actually important to think of what's the evolution, what's required differently from leaders today versus a few years ago. And I think for me the answer there is think of your people's heads, hearts, and hands. So it's not only looking at the technology side or not only looking at the outcomes and the results, but really focusing who's sitting in front of you. And I think that's that human-centric connection within all the AI and technology that we face.
I'm reminded as we are navigating the different pieces of this conversation about so if we bring that back to women in the workplace, and I know that the one common place where we tend to gravitate when we talk about these things is that whole concept of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and so on. And we know, of course, that different organizations use different terminology for all these things, but I'm hearing that kind of coming as a golden thread through all of this, the elements that we've just touched on.
Absolutely. And I think that is one, when I think of celebrating women in Women Month, exactly like you said, that's the golden thread. Because if we think, what does women unique, or perhaps not uniquely, what does women bring to the workplace is that I want to call it the empathy equation. They're usually very good with sensing what's going on. And they're not, their default style might not be command and control. But we see that they focus on collaboration, bringing the team together, having that caring, supportive way of leading their teams. And I think when you talk about diversity and inclusion, I think that's the starting point for any individual to have that sense of belonging. So critical.
So absolutely. And I mean, if we talk about belonging, inclusion and belonging specifically, I do want to punctuate, and I've seen that come through a lot in the literature, that we do not want, or we at least want to be conscious that as we talk about women, it isn't just one homogeneous mass of people, that within women, we also need to acknowledge, for example, that there are different experiences that speak to women of color. And, you know, especially in South Africa, that's something that we cannot not focus on. And we also need to look at issues around disability, and more specifically, and equally importantly, to look at issues such as diversity from a point of view of the LGBTQ plus community as well, and not assume that we are talking about just one mass, and therefore that in all of these things that we are talking about, we've got to consider what it means for the specific group, and be conscious and deliberate about what we are doing in the corporate space to align with all of those considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I have seen best of organization, what they do differently, is exactly what you refer to now, Khosi, is that when we have a leadership development program, as an example, we focus specifically on women of color, or we include content for women of color. And as you say, make that the topic. And in the end, then actually measure and start to gather data to say, is the dial moving or not?
To track that.
Or what is the,
to track that. And, you know, they're talking about intersectionality, that it's not just one, but to look at both dynamics and to track how that, how the organization is moving in those elements. So with this conversation being about women's experiences, and we've just, you know, foregrounded that with the trends that we're seeing in the workspace, what would you say are challenges that women, you know, face specifically? And I know you've gone some way in terms of celebrating and recognizing the unique contribution that women bring into the workspace. What would you say the other side of that coin is in terms of challenges?
Khosi, when I think of challenges, the first one that comes to mind is that need for flexibility. I think depending where you are in your life cycle, in your career journey, it might be different for different people. So let me share one or two practical examples. So I was in a conversation with a young lady recently. She's a qualified CA in her late 30s. She has a great job. I think she's financial manager at her organization. And the dilemma that she's facing is, do I need to have kids or not? How will having kids impact my career? Because her aim is obviously to become CFO. And for me, that was quite a big challenge to think that a young lady, very successful, is facing, do I need, or how do I make the decision, becoming a mom or not?
And I think that's a very interesting point of reflection, because I think historically, what we know is that, you know, women have had to take a knock, you know, and step outside of that space to, you know, to fulfill that desire to also, in addition to their aspirations, their career aspirations, but also the desire perhaps to also be a mother. And, you know, there's that talk about the punishment of that women have had to suffer for stepping out so that one came at the expense of the other. But what I'm hearing also is that are we perhaps shifting towards a time when we can conceive of how we bring those two together, that flexibility is a flexibility that allows us to integrate rather than to see these as competing priorities as such?
Absolutely, and I think especially if you then have a look at it from a male or a male leader, to say, be considerate and be aware of the challenges that the employee might have. I don't think it's necessarily something that the individual will share, but at least just to be aware of that. Another great example is a lady that's a mother of 2 young boys, and I actually smiled. We were talking about flexibility and time management and having, you know, keeping all the balls in the air. And her challenge, we spoke about self-care and the risk of, you know, burnout, because there were definite signs when we had the conversation. And when she said, but Anja, I literally don't have 20 minutes a day for myself. Now, when we think of corporate South Africa, that's another challenge that we face. How do you keep all those balls in the air?
Yes. I also imagine that if we look at somebody like her, we can't perhaps look at flexibility without also considering the benefits to the male employees as well, because it means that a person such as the woman that you're referring to, if there is flexibility within the workspace, her partner, who perhaps is also working, it would benefit both of them to be able to co-parent more effectively when there is that flexibility, so to be able to, again, extend the landscape rather than to be forced to choose between one and the other, because I think the history has been that women have had to, and men's careers have continued uninterrupted, but it has come at the expense of the advancement of women who have had to step out to take on that nurturing role. And we're saying with flexibility, it also brings the men into also not just the hunter to bring in the bacon and to go and earn the money, but to also be able to not just be an absent father or secondary parent. With flexibility, they can also be able to integrate those two roles as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You said it so well, Khosi.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the spectrum, so we spoke about people with young children or even needing to make the decision about having kids.
Yeah.
But at the other side of the spectrum, a challenge that people might face is now I need to take care of my aging or a parent that's ill.
Right.
And I specifically know about someone where they went out of they left their career to take care of their mom for 2 years. And the challenge now as an elderly, or not elderly, but an older woman to get back in the workplace seems challenging. So I think that's also, as you said, that flexibility. How do we navigate our careers?
Yeah.
And that's where I love that metaphor. I think you've mentioned it one, Khosi, about the jungle gym, so that the career is not a ladder. Please elaborate on that one.
So another angle or perspective that I like to add to the ladder is one that the ladder is generally more like a triangle in that it's pointed, and the higher you go, the narrower it becomes, and hence you then find that jostling, that competition, and people struggling to understand and find their place, because everybody understands success as moving up to that narrow point and that competitiveness. Yeah. Whereas for me, what I love about the analogy of the jungle gym is that it's lateral. It moves in different directions, and it is about, again, an important part for me also is about finding your own purpose and working towards that purpose, as opposed to everybody chasing the so-called ladder, and for reasons that are not aligned to their own truth, their own authenticity. That success is as much in moving laterally as it is about not just moving upwards in the sense of the ladder as such. So that for me is a much more workable and a much richer. And also, if you just imagine the jungle gym, there's play there, and there's more people and more space for us to work with, rather than just like, that one unidirectional way in which the ladder speaks to it.
Yeah, and I love that, because as you say, going down the slide or you're on the swing now, irrelevant where you are, it is what works for you at the moment.
Yeah, and I think what it also links to is the point that we were making earlier on about the transgenerational difference. Yeah. Because as much as you were talking about those people that, in terms of perhaps the traditional mold and the traditional aspirations of getting married and having children, and you were talking about people also having aging parents to look after those. But I also think an important consideration, also in terms of women specifically, is how there's a choice now. And the younger generation are very much alert to that. I don't have to. It is equally an important and valid choice for somebody like me, who for many years have felt like, the odd one out, sticking out. But now, with more people entering, the younger generation entering that space, there is freedom to be okay with choosing to be husband-free, to being child-free, and also having to have that conversation that says, what does flexibility look like for me? So that it's not just a privilege for those that have children to look after, and then it punishes those of us who are child-free. But it is also that flexibility. I also need that, but what does it look like for me in my world? Because I'm also remembering, when we were studying and we were talking about deployment for our community service, starting to become a clinical psychologist. And I remember we had this big conversation with the Department of Health, because what they were saying at the time is that in terms of the allocation of placements, it is that those people who are married and have children will be placed in the closer areas and hospitals, and those people who are not married and don't have children will be thrown to the far-flung areas. Yeah. And I said, excuse me.
This is not fair.
No. It is not fair. Just because we don't have those doesn't mean our lives are less valuable. Yeah. It is equally real for me. And on some other level, I could even argue that they are the ones that have the security of relationship and children. Maybe they can be thrown into, the far-flung areas, and those of us are the ones. So again, it's not an easy one, but what I'm hearing is that conversation needs to happen.
Yeah, and Khosi, what you've just said, what I love was that authenticity of being who you are with your choices and still, contributing no matter what choices you've made. Sure. And I think the point, as you said, was that flexibility is a big need for so many of us, not only for the moms with children.
Absolutely. We want to do different things.
So, Khosi, the one that we have not spoken about is Gen Zs, people entering into the workplace. Any challenges that comes to mind for you when you think of that group?
I think if we think about that generation, some of the points we've already touched on, but I think the one thing we cannot take for granted is that previously, if I look at previous generations, there was an assumption of you're going to enter the conveyor belt and come out on the other side. Gen Z is much more circumspect. They are much more conscious. They do not feel the pressure to be anything that they don't want to become, so they're very much about bringing themselves to the workplace, whereas before perhaps it was more like, that leave yourself to some extent at the gate, and when you come here, this is what you're expected to do. They are not in that mindset. For them, purpose is so much more important. What they do matters so much, and it matters so much that it determines whether they want to join an employer or not, who is considerate. Flexibility is a much more bigger priority for them, and it's an integral part of how they understand well-being overall. So you're not just going to bribe them with money, because that's not so much a driver for them, and hence that analogy of the jungle gym, they are much more willing to explore different parts of themselves, and that world, the world of work, needs to accommodate that rather than just a vertical climb, so to speak.
Yeah, and perhaps to build on what you said is also their need for learning. I think for all of us, having that continuous learning mindset is important, but I think for them it's critical that they want to see I'm learning and I'm progressing and I'm making...
and I think they are not as patient as previous generations. For them, learning is much quicker because they've got access, immediate access to information, and therefore their pace and the need to keep them interested is perhaps so much higher than it used to be previously. And of course, they're not afraid of technology. They see it as an integral part of who they are as people, but equally so who they are in the workplace.
Yeah, and interesting, what came to mind for me is then just to remind them, as you say, they're impatient, they want to move the world, to remember that it's okay to make mistakes. We're all human. I think sometimes we want to be so perfect. And if something small goes wrong, it is this big thing. And actually to see that as a learning opportunity. And not necessarily label it as a mistake.
And I think it is that patience with process. Because I think one of the things, and I often talk, when I talk about the difference between us and the younger generations, and even more so, the Gen Z that we are talking about right now, is that we have had to learn patience with process. Because in our time, for example, things had to be made, you had to wait. Whereas in their time,
instant gratification.
Instant gratification. So they asked the question, why must it take me 5 years to get to a certain point? Whereas for us, you know, we understood that there was that process, and therefore, to your point, that part of learning is about learning to make mistakes, and being okay that is part of the journey of becoming who they are as human beings, in as much as they are learning what it means in the jungle gym to explore different roles, and that perhaps is something that we will never outgrow as such, but it is how do we work with that, you know, that the term that comes to mind right now is one of the imposter syndrome. And I think it's a particularly important one to think about when we think about coming back to the center of women and how we show up in the workspace, and how we the aspirations to rise and climb to the senior levels of the organization, that the challenge is always, do I have to do it in the way that males have shown up and have climbed to those senior positions, or is it okay to be me, you know, as a woman, and therefore the challenge to second guess ourselves as we go through that journey.
Yeah, and Khosi, while you were saying that, it actually reminded me of the jungle gym, and you spoke about imposter, and for us to remember that it's actually irrelevant where you are on the jungle gym of your career. All of us at some point or sometime or another actually feels like the imposter. I'm not good enough, or question, am I good enough to be there?
And the more roles people explore, the more unlearning and relearning there is, and therefore it becomes important to be patient with ourselves on that journey.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that we said we will touch on also is that, you know, as we look at women and women in the world of work, there are some myths that I think we need to touch on, and perhaps sober them up somewhat with more of a realistic perspective. So what would you say is perhaps a myth, top of mind myth for you in relation to women in the workspace?
So there's two that comes to mind. So the first one is the whole concept of microaggressions, and we can elaborate on what does it mean.
Yes,
but
it's an interesting term, but actually it would be useful for us to unpack what that is exactly.
That means, and then on the other side would be the whole concept of, you know, breaking through the glass ceiling and getting to that role that you want to aspire.
Right.
And looking at the stats, the latest research, that it's actually nothing to do with the glass ceiling, but looking at that broken rung, and talking about what that means for the woman in work.
So what is that? So maybe let's start with microaggressions, because that's quite a term. And just at the sound of it, it suggests two things: that there is some form of aggression, but that it's micro. Is it really what that is?
So, Khosi, I think what comes to mind for me when I think of microaggression would be it seems small. It's someone interrupting you in a meeting. It's someone taking credit for the work that you've done. So it's small. Is it really a big issue? And I think that in my mind, it seems small, but it's actually deep, or it can have a deep impact. And how do you navigate that?
Right. So the term that comes to mind for me is that of disproportionate effect.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
So that even though it is micro, actually its impact runs much deeper than just the surface. And one of the things that links to that for me directly is, again, if we shift from this view of women as a homogeneous mass, but that microaggressions affect different women differently. So if we look, for example, at black women or women of color, there is a specific experience that is tied to that, and that organizations need to be aware of. And one of those is assumption of sameness. You know, that all of you look alike, and people will throw that, or that I don't see your color, which is, again, a form of invalidation. And because what that says is that you're choosing to deny or to erode or take away from me a part of my identity. And I know that many a times that comes from a good place of people that, are suggesting, are saying, or the intent behind it is to say, I don't look at you through that lens of culture. And it's kind of like the human being rather than the color of your skin. But in that is a level at which it invalidates an important part of somebody's identity as well.
Yeah, and I think that illustrates when we said the evolution of leadership, bringing in that cultural awareness, bringing in that sensitivity, just really looking at who's the human sitting in front of you. Sure. And as you said, the intent might not be bad. Sure. The intent might be, I'm making a joke because you all look the same, or I did not recognize you, or whatever it might be. But in the end, as you said, the disproportionate impact that will have on the working relationship or the collaboration going forward.
Yeah, an employee experience that we were talking about earlier on. The other one that you touched on was around the glass ceiling versus the broken rung.
Yeah.
What is that?
So what I've seen there, so let me start with some research. Looking at the data, we spoke a lot about data, is that when we look at the percentage of women in the C-suite, I think about 24% of people, I think it's an American study done by McKinsey, 24% is represented by women. Women of color, all women.
Overall.
And if you, all overall women. And if you have a look at the entry management positions, it's about 48%. So that looks good. I mean, it's almost 50% of women being in entry roles. But you know where the interesting part is, if you have a look at the data over the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in the number at C-suite level.
Right.
But the entry level stayed exactly the same. So even though the 48 seems good, it's actually not good at all, because there's no progress. And that's what they mean. There's no way of breaking through the ceiling, where the problem is we're actually not giving them an opportunity in the first place. We're overlooking them when we when we build our talent pool or when we appoint people.
In that progression.
In that progression.
So there's that gap because
of
that break in that rung.
Absolutely.
Which means then that the barriers to entry or the barriers to escalation or climbing to the C-suite, as it were, remains formidable. And I would imagine, again, what we were saying about, if that is the case for women in general, it would be equally important to track the specific matrices around women of color, around women with disabilities, and around women from the LGBTQ plus community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've spoken about that. And then when you look at how do we develop leaders, how do we develop the programs to make sure that you specifically include content for people from that specific group.
Yeah, and that intersectionality, rather than looking at them in isolation, because what you are saying is you may be talking about a woman of color who has a disability and who is also a member of the LGBTQ community. So rather than in isolation, to look at an integrated, to take an integrated perspective around those dynamics.
Yeah.
All right, phew. Quite a lot of things. I think perhaps having said all that, without kind of creating a sense that there's a formidable challenges, what skills do we want to share or to put in this space that people can draw on, or women specifically, as we navigate these trends, as we navigate these challenges, as we seek to break some of these myths that we've talked about?
Yeah, and for me, that magic one, Khosi, is the quality of our conversations.
Right.
I think women has now got the courage to speak up, but when they speak up, are you doing it in the right way? So I think if we can perhaps leave 2 or 3 skills or thoughts with the listeners, that would be ideal, something that they can implement today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if you're talking about earlier on the unique contribution that women bring, we spoke about collaboration, we spoke about connection, we spoke about empathy. How do we bring that? How do we pull that together in terms of the quality of engagement? I think earlier on you mentioned the committing to dialogue.
Committing to dialogue, and I think that would definitely be the first step. So when the listeners think of having a conversation, being it about someone interrupting you during meetings, being it about the partner that needs to co-parent, whatever the conversation needs to be, commit to dialogue. Because it's all well for you having the conversation, but we want that interaction. We want them sharing. And
so the opposite of monologue as such, because with these risky and sensitive conversations, it's very easy and tempting for us to want my way and not your way. But you're saying with dialogue is about it being a two-way process.
Yeah, and I think what works for me is to remain curious, to really listen attentively, to understand what you're saying, and not in my mind coming, this is my next sentence, or this is going to be the card that I'm now throwing. So really remaining curious and understanding what the other person is saying.
Easier said than done, I would imagine, because also in the heat of that moment with those types of conversations, it's very much easy to get hooked and kind of lose track of your intentions in that conversation.
Yeah, and that's why I think the tip number 2 would be in control of you.
Yeah.
So when you enter that conversation, and I think perhaps to give a little bit of explanation there, it's so important for us to say, if we want to be in control and we want to know how we're going to, or choose how we're going to behave, we need to understand what's driving our behaviors.
Right.
And if you, let's use that example of someone interrupting you in a meeting. Looking at that, and you see that the manager is interrupting you 3 times. Now, as that is happening, you tell yourself a story.
Right. Yeah. About yourself.
About myself. Doesn't trust my ideas, or she doesn't want me to she's not curious or interested to hear my contribution, whatever it might be. But what we need to remember, Khosi, is in that moment when you tell yourself that story, or you come to the conclusion, that's what's driving your emotions.
Right.
That's what's driving you to be frustrated, to be irritated or agitated.
And invariably it's going to come out in your behavior, the things you're going to say and do in that moment.
Yeah.
Which then suggests how you then frame that from intent to how you articulate that becomes also quite important.
Yeah, and the intent for me, and I don't know about you, but whenever I think of intent, it's really creating that context for the other person to understand why this is such an important issue. Why am I having this conversation? So once again, we can use any of the challenges we've mentioned today. Let them understand, why is this so important?
So to take them to the backstage of the conversation, something that's not immediately available to them of where you are coming from. Why would you say that? Why would you do something like that? To kind of take them by the hand into the backstage and helping them understand where you're coming from in your behavior. Yeah.
And when we think of sharing your intent, something practical that the listeners can do is answer 4 questions. Think, what is it that I want in this conversation or in this moment? What do I want for myself? What is it that I want for the other person that I'm having the conversation with? What about our working relationship or the personal relationship? And then lastly, what is it that I want for our family, our team, our organization? And when you answer those questions, that's how you become clear on framing your intent.
Sure. Absolutely. I imagine that would then guide the things you're going to say and do, and therefore perhaps maximizes prospects for mutual understanding, which is that commitment that you were talking about when you say commit to dialogue and be curious about where the other person is coming from.
Yeah. I remember when we spoke about the tips, Khosi, you said that you want to share state my path. Why is that so powerful?
Well, I think for me it's important because it says it's not anything goes. And in the heat of that moment, it's very easy to just lose track and, the conversation goes everywhere. But one of the things, or the first and most important thing that we want to be clear about is the difference between what happened and the stories you were talking about, what I think about what happens. Because many a times we tend to then think that what I think about it is a fact.
The fact, I get you.
And when things get muddled up in that conversation, chances for that conversation to get out of hand, are very much higher. So if we are able to distinguish the facts of what happened and what I think about it, you can hold them both, but they are not synonyms. And so when you then state your path or express yourself or your meaning, it is about what were the facts of that situation, and perhaps help the other person understand the impact of those facts in terms of how you see yourself, how you see them, how you see the issue that you're trying to deal with. And equally importantly, going back to where you started in terms of saying, ask them after you've shared your side. Because just like you, they have their own version of facts, perhaps. They also have their own thoughts about those facts. And it is about how do we bring those two together for mutual understanding in that situation.
Lovely.
Well, I think we've kind of covered the ground, perhaps even if we've just scratched the surface, because I'm sure if we had more time, we could continue to talk more. I think for me, this is a good segue into, as you look at yourself from your life cycle. You started off earlier on, you were in a different space to where you are today. What tips would you leave perhaps to the generation on the opposite side of where you are and where you are finding yourself, that are entering, the Gen Z that are entering the world of work? What tips would you share with them?
Yeah, Khosi, such an interesting question, and something that I haven't mentioned. Just to close the circle, I mentioned that when I met the Human Edge, that I was a single mom of 2 young children. I'm now happily married, a mom of a blended family. So you can imagine the skills that we've just shared with the listeners, how much I use that to navigate blending the family together. I think the one, as I said, that stood out for me, that start with heart. What is it that you really want in that moment? But your question, what is my advice to the younger generation? And I think they are so eager to make a difference. So they're so eager to make a meaningful contribution. And I think the first tip that I would leave with them is use the power of your subconscious mind. Start each day with setting your intention. How am I going to show up? Who do I want to be remembered for? And in those challenging moments, just choose. This is what I want to be remembered for. The second one that comes to mind for me is that the power of giving and receiving feedback, which is very practical. But I've seen that with the youngsters in the home, that, Mom, this has happened, and that just the quality of, or the ability to give feedback and to receive feedback with an open heart, almost being like a sponge and learn as much as you can. And I think that's what I want to leave with them. Be who you are authentically, without apology, but have that open mind to learn as you navigate through the jungle gym.
Great, that's beautiful. I think to just kind of, continue from where you are and looking at my life on the opposite side of that spectrum, being child-free and being husband-free, I do want to, to invite women to think about that choice as well as a very valid choice. To choose to be child-free, for example, because previously it felt as though it was compulsory. And what I've been hearing over the years, and more so, would be women that would say to me, how did you know that there was even a choice? to be child-free, because they thought that everybody, just because you're a woman, you have to be a mother, or that you have to be married for it to define you as a woman. It is for me to give women that freedom to really be themselves, and that these are options, these are not obligations, and that there is nothing wrong with you. And that, you know, as much as I honor women that choose to be mothers, and I honor women that choose to be married, that it is an equally valid option not to do so, and that it doesn't make you any less of a woman. And again, an issue that we talked about is that the corporate space has so many options. Life itself has so many options. And one of the beautiful things that I enjoy, at least about my life, is that I hear this in my clients as a clinical psychologist, you know, people that would say, I wish my life was different. If I didn't have the responsibility of children, I would do things differently. And for me, it is a gift to have that freedom to make those choices where I say, I don't have any obligation, you know, to pay school fees and so on. And so I have a much wider choice about what I want to do with my life. And it is an experience that I do want to put on the table, at the center of the table, as we look at what it means to be a woman going forward, that it is a choice, and the choices are much wider than, you know, society has led us to believe in the past.
Yeah, so Khosi, when I think of a tip that I would like to share with the leaders, I want to circle back to what I mentioned in the beginning, that it's a human-centric leadership style.
Right.
How do you activate the head, the heart, and the hands? And what comes to mind for me is for the leaders to think of building psychological safety.
Yeah.
Because if you build psychological safety, it's simply saying that you are seen, heard, and respected. And if we say we want our people to be innovative, solve problems, and serve the customers, that's what building a psychological safe environment will support you. And perhaps a few tips around psychological safety, just thinking of the consultative management style, the supportive management style, and we said that's actually something that the women excel in, you know, creating that support. But also
the collaborative.
The collaborative, yeah, absolutely. But also thinking of challenging. So it's not only consultation and support, it's challenging as well. But I think it's about finding that sweet spot.
Yes.
Because if we only challenging, that's when we leave people feeling anxious. And if it's only supportive, they might be in a comfort zone because we're not stretching them. So my tip would be is find that sweet spot where you give the support, where you see the individual, understand what their requirements are, but still stretch them out of their comfort zone.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think that is enough food for thought for one day. Thank you so much for your insightful insights, Anja.
Yeah, it was lovely. Thank you, Khosi. Doing this with you for the first time.